Welcome back to another journey through the Star Wars galaxy. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most fascinating additions to Star Wars canon in recent years, a civilization that predates the Jedi Order itself, a species so advanced in their understanding of the Force that they built temples across multiple worlds, created technology that merged seamlessly with Force abilities, and left behind mysteries that would shape the fate of survivors fleeing the Empire's purge. We're talking about the Zeffo, sometimes called the Zephonians, an ancient race whose ruins hold both promise and warning for those brave enough or foolish enough to explore them. The Zeffo first entered Star Wars canon through the game Jedi Fallen Order, developed by Respawn Entertainment and released in 2019, but their significance has only grown since then, with references appearing in comics, novels, and even the Ahsoka series. These weren't just background decorations or convenient plot devices. The Zeffo represent something profound in the Star Wars universe. They're a mirror held up to the Jedi Order, showing what happens when a Force-sensitive civilization lets pride and the hunger for power corrupt their original noble purpose. They're a warning, written in stone and silence. They're empty temples, testament to the dangers of dogma and the seductive nature of the dark side. Tonight, we're going to explore everything we know about the Zeffo, their origins on a wind-swept world in the Outer Rim, the rise of their most powerful Force users, the Sages, who commanded respect and shaped their culture, the incredible technology they developed, blending ancient understanding of the Force with mechanical innovation in ways the galaxy had rarely seen. We'll walk through their temples, decipher their philosophy, and trace the path of their downfall. We'll follow Jedi Master Eno Cordova as he pieces together their history decades before Order 66, and we'll join Cal Kestis as he retraces those steps in a desperate attempt to preserve what remains of the Jedi Order. But more than just a history lesson, the story of the Zeffo asks uncomfortable questions. How similar were they to the Jedi? What lessons did they fail to learn that led to their extinction? And perhaps most troubling, are we witnessing the same pattern repeat itself across different eras of the galaxy? The Zeffo achieved greatness and fell into ruin. The Jedi rose to prominence and were all but destroyed. Is this simply the inevitable arc of any Force-sensitive civilization, or could it have been different? Settle in, get comfortable. This is going to be a long journey through time, across multiple worlds, and deep into mysteries that even the cleverest Jedi scholars couldn't fully unravel. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the Zeffo matter, not just to Fallen Order's story, but to the larger mythology of Star Wars itself. You'll see their influence in places you might not have noticed. Understand the warnings they left behind, and perhaps recognize echoes of their mistakes in other corners of the galaxy far, far away. Origins of a civilization. Let's begin at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as the fragmented historical record allows. The Zeffo homeworld sits in the Outer Rim territories, in a system that bears their name. It's not a comfortable planet by most standards. Electromagnetic winds sweep across its surface constantly, strong enough to interfere with technology, powerful enough to shape the landscape over millennia. Mountains of gray stone rise from grasslands, their peaks often shrouded in storm clouds. Water is abundant here, pooling in lakes and flowing in rivers between the highlands. But it's cold water, temperamental water, reflecting the moody skies above. The planet's location placed it near the Viragi trade route, though whether the Zeffo established that route or simply benefited from it remains unclear. What we do know is that Zeffo was isolated enough to develop its own distinct culture, yet connected enough to eventually spread that culture to other worlds. The electromagnetic phenomena that made the planet challenging for most species seemed to suit the Zeffo perfectly. Some scholars who studied their ruins theorized that these natural electromagnetic fields actually enhanced their force sensitivity, creating an environment where even those with modest abilities could perceive the deeper currents of the galaxy. The Zeffo themselves were humanoid in their basic structure, though the details of their exact appearance remain somewhat uncertain. Based on the statues and artistic representations they left behind, they appear to have been tall, with a commanding physical presence. Their heads were the most distinctive feature, elongated and broad, with large, deep-set eyes that seemed to look through the physical world into something beyond. The cranial ridges that swept back from their foreheads weren't just decorative, suggesting they may have served some biological function, though what that function was remains lost to time. Their name for the force was the life wind. This wasn't just poetic language or metaphor. To the Zeffo, the force truly behaved like wind, invisible but everywhere, capable of gentle caresses or violent storms, flowing through all living things and connecting them in patterns that could be read by those who learned to perceive them. The constant winds of their homeworld likely inspired this understanding. When you grow up on a planet where physical wind shapes every aspect of daily life, where you must account for its force in your architecture and agriculture, it makes sense that you would conceptualize the force itself in similar terms. The early Zeffo civilization organized itself around principles of balance and harmony. They weren't warlike or conquest-driven, at least not in their origins. Their society valued learning, the pursuit of understanding, and the development of both technological and force-based abilities. They built their cities to work with the wind rather than against it, creating structures that channeled the electromagnetic currents flowing across their world. Their architecture featured sweeping curves and carefully positioned openings, allowing wind to flow through buildings in patterns that early Zeffo scholars believed enhanced meditation and force connection. Community mattered deeply to the ancient Zeffo. While they would eventually develop a hierarchy based on force ability, their early culture emphasized collective achievement rather than individual glory. They created art that celebrated their connection to the natural world. Murals depicting Zeffo reaching toward the sky, their hands open to receive the life wind. They carved enormous statues showing Zeffo figures holding perfect spheres, representations of their understanding that the Force, like their planet's winds, flowed in cycles and could be contained, channeled, and directed by those with sufficient skill. But what truly set the Zeffo apart from many other pre-spaceflight civilizations was their relationship with the Force. While not every Zephonian possessed Force sensitivity, the trait was common enough that they built their entire society around it. Force ability wasn't seen as something to hide or fear. It was celebrated, cultivated, and systematically developed. Young Zeffo who showed even modest connection to the life wind received training, not to become warriors or enforcers, but to become scholars and guides. The Force was for understanding the galaxy, for achieving harmony with natural cycles, for perceiving truths that lay beyond ordinary senses. This early period of Zeffo civilization produced some of their most beautiful works. The murals in the tomb of Eilram, one of their best preserved sites, show this era clearly. Zeffo figures are depicted in flowing robes, their arms outstretched, surrounded by swirling patterns representing the life wind. These aren't images of conquest or domination. They're images of communion, of a species learning to exist in harmony with something greater than themselves. The artwork has a meditative quality, suggesting that its creation was itself a spiritual practice, a way of connecting with the Force through artistic expression. Their language reflected this philosophy too. Zephonian was a deep, resonant tongue with drawn-out vocalizations that mimicked the sound of wind moving through stone passages. Written Zephonian used elaborate hieroglyphs, complex symbols that often required understanding of context and multiple meanings to properly interpret. A single glyph might represent a physical object, a philosophical concept, and a force technique simultaneously. This made Zephonian writing dense with information but challenging to translate. Master Cordova spent years learning to read even basic Zeffo texts, and he admitted in his notes that he likely missed nuances that a native speaker would have immediately understood. The planet itself seems to have played a crucial role in shaping Zeffo philosophy. Living in an environment of constant electromagnetic activity, where the invisible forces of their world made themselves known through their effects on metal, water, and living tissue, the Zeffo developed an acute awareness of invisible influences. They understood that reality had layers beyond the immediately visible. The life wind was just one of many unseen forces that shaped existence, and learning to perceive and interact with these forces became the foundation of their civilization's advancement. As their society matured, the the Zeffo began to explore their world more thoroughly, discovering sites of particular significance where the life wind seemed to flow with greater intensity. These locations became pilgrimage sites, places where Zeffo would journey to deepen their connection to the Force. Over time, structures were built at these sites. First, simple meditation platforms, then increasingly elaborate temples that incorporated their growing understanding of how architecture could enhance Force perception. Wind chimes were hung in specific patterns, their sounds creating harmonic frequencies believed to aid in achieving deeper meditative states. Chambers were carved from living rock at angles that maximized the flow of wind through them, creating natural amplification of the sounds and sensations that helped guide practitioners into Force-enhanced awareness. This period of cultural development laid the foundation for everything that would follow. The Zeffo established patterns of thinking, methods of training, and philosophical frameworks that would guide their civilization for thousands of years. They created a society where Force sensitivity was not just accepted, but celebrated as the highest form of achievement. And in doing so, they also created the conditions for their eventual corruption. Because when your entire civilization revolves around Force ability, when your greatest minds and leaders are chosen based on their connection to this power, what happens when someone uses that power not for harmony and understanding, but for control and domination? The answer to that question would come later, after centuries of growth and expansion. But even in their origins, even in their most innocent period, the seeds of the Zeffo's downfall were being planted. They were creating a culture that valued Force power above all else. They were building a hierarchy based on ability rather than wisdom, and they were teaching generation after generation that the life wind was something to be mastered, controlled, and directed according to the will of those strong enough to do so. These teachings would serve them well in their golden age, but they would also pave the way for someone who understood that control and domination were just different expressions of the same fundamental principle. The Age of the Sages. As Zeffo civilization advanced, a new tier of leadership emerged. These were individuals whose Force sensitivity far exceeded the norm, who could perceive and manipulate the life wind with such skill that they seemed to exist partially in another dimension of reality. The Zeffo called them sages, and their rise marked the golden age of Zephonian culture, but it also marked the beginning of the path toward their eventual extinction. Because the concentration of power in the hands of a few, no matter how wise or well-intentioned those few might be, creates opportunities for corruption that even the most vigilant society struggles to prevent. The sages weren't officially rulers in the traditional sense. The Zeffo maintained other governmental structures, councils, and administrators who handled the day-to-day functioning of their society. But the sages held something more valuable than formal authority. They held respect, reverence, ordering on worship. When a sage spoke, people listened. When a sage established a new temple or training ground, resources flowed to make it happen. The sages were living bridges between the mundane world and the deeper truths of the Force. and their wisdom was considered sacred, their teachings law in all but name. Among the many sages who emerged over the centuries of Zeffo civilization, 3 stand out in the historical record. Their tombs survived when so much else was lost. Their names appear repeatedly in Zeffo inscriptions, and their influence, both positive and catastrophically negative, shaped not just their own time, but echoed forward to affect events millennia after their deaths. These 3 were Eilram, Miktrull, and Kujet. Let's examine each in turn, starting with the most benevolent and working our way toward the darkness. Eilram represented the best of what the sages could be. A Zeffo of profound wisdom and genuine compassion, Eilram embodied the original principles of their civilization. Eilram's great achievement wasn't just personal mastery of the Force, though by all accounts that mastery was considerable. It was the establishment of relationships with other species across the galaxy. Eilram understood something that many Force-sensitive civilizations failed to grasp: that wisdom can be found in unexpected places, that other cultures have value even if they don't share your Force abilities or your philosophical framework. Eilram's particular fascination centered on the Wookiees of Kashyyyk. This jungle world, so different from the windswept mountains of Zeffo, captivated Eilram. The towering Roshir trees that defined Kashyyyk's landscape, the complex ecosystem that existed in their branches, the Wookiee culture built around these natural wonders. All of it represented an approach to existence that complemented rather than competed with Zeffo philosophy. Eilram spent considerable time on Kashyyyk, learning from the Wookiees even as they learned from the Sage. This cultural exchange enriched both civilizations and established diplomatic ties that would persist for generations. When Eilram died, the Zeffo people honored their sage in a way that perfectly captured the individual's legacy. The tomb of Eilram was built as both a final resting place and a monument to cross-cultural understanding. The structure served initially as a proving ground where young Force-sensitive Zeffo could train, honing their abilities through a series of challenges that required not just power, but wisdom, not just force, but finesse. The tomb incorporated wind mechanics in brilliant ways, using the natural air currents of Zeffo to create puzzles that could only be solved by understanding how the life wind flowed through physical spaces. But the most striking feature of Eilram's tomb was its ceiling. Carved directly into the stone dome above the burial chamber was an enormous representation of a Roshir tree, the defining feature of Kashyyyk's landscape. This wasn't just decorative. It was statement of values, a reminder carved in stone that wisdom comes from many sources, that isolation breeds ignorance, and that the strongest civilizations are those that learn from their neighbors rather than standing apart in proud seclusion. Eilram's sarcophagus rests beneath these stone roots, forever interred in a space that honors both Zeffo tradition and the alien culture that the sage had come to love. Miktrull, the second of our 3 notable sages, represented a different aspect of Zeffo culture. Where Eilram looked outward, seeking connections with other species and worlds, Miktrull looked inward, focusing on the deepening of Zeffo understanding of the Force itself. Miktrull's approach was more demanding, less gentle than Eilram's. This sage expected greatness from students and accepted nothing less. Offerings were required from those who sought Miktrull's wisdom, not material wealth, but demonstrations of commitment, proof that the seeker was serious about their pursuit of understanding. Miktrull's tomb reflects this more austere approach. Built high above a massive pit, accessible only through a complex series of passages and challenges, the structure feels less welcoming than Eilram's monument. The tomb is hung with hundreds of candles, their flames representing the individual seekers who came to learn from Miktrull. These weren't decorative candles, they were offerings, each one placed by someone hoping to gain wisdom from the sage. The fact that they remained lit for millennia speaks to the Zeffo's technological sophistication, their ability to create flames that burned without fuel, sustained by force-infused energy fields. The Temple of Miktrull showcases the Zeffo's mastery of combining force abilities with mechanical systems. Throughout the structure, enormous bronze spheres serve as power sources. These aren't simple batteries or generators. They're force-resonant objects, capable of storing and conducting massive amounts of energy while remaining responsive to force manipulation. A skilled practitioner can use the force to move these spheres despite their size, positioning them to power different systems, activate platforms, or create bridges across otherwise impassable gaps. The entire tomb functions as a giant puzzle, requiring visitors to demonstrate their understanding of how physical forces, electromagnetic fields, and the life wind interact with each other. Miktrull's philosophy emphasized the complexity of mastery. This sage taught that true understanding of the Force required not just meditation and peaceful contemplation, but active engagement with how the Force manifested in the physical world. Gravity was an expression of the Force. Magnetism was an expression of the Force. The movement of wind and water, the growth of plants, the very structure of matter itself, all were expressions of the same underlying reality that the Zeffo called the life wind. To master one's connection to the Force meant understanding these connections, seeing how the invisible and visible realms influenced each other. This philosophy produced Zeffo Force users with practical, applicable skills. They could manipulate objects with precision because they understood the forces acting on those objects. They could predict weather patterns because they could sense the energy flows in the atmosphere. They could enhance their technology with force-infused components because they understood how consciousness and mechanism could interface. Miktrull's legacy was a generation of sages and Force practitioners who were simultaneously mystics and scientists, spiritual seekers who used empirical observation and testing to deepen their understanding. But this emphasis on power and mastery, however well-intentioned, created an environment where the next sage we need to discuss could rise to prominence. Because if the Force is something to be mastered, if power is something to be accumulated and demonstrated, then what stops someone from taking those principles to their logical extreme? What prevents someone from deciding that true mastery means not just understanding the Force, but dominating it, bending it entirely to one's will, regardless of the cost? The answer, as the Zeffo would learn to their sorrow, is nothing prevents it. Not philosophy, not tradition, not the warnings of history. When an individual with sufficient Force ability and insufficient wisdom decides that power is the only thing that matters, that control is the ultimate expression of mastery, the results are catastrophic. This brings us to Kujet, the third and final of our notable sages, the one who would lead the entire Zeffo civilization into darkness and eventual extinction. Kujet came after Eilram and Miktrull, inheriting a civilization at the height of its power and influence. The Zeffo had spread to multiple worlds by this point. Their temples could be found on Bogano, on Totho, Kashyyyk, and Dathomir. Their understanding of the Force had reached sophisticated levels. Their technology was advanced enough to create structures and devices that would function for millennia after their civilization's collapse. By any objective measure, the Zeffo were successful. They had achieved what few civilizations manage: lasting influence across multiple star systems, a coherent culture maintained across vast distances, and a stable society built on shared philosophical principles. But success breeds complacency. Comfort creates vulnerability. And in Kujet, all the latent dangers in Zeffo philosophy found their expression. This sage looked at the Zeffo civilization and saw not a triumph of wisdom and balance, but a frustrating limitation. Why should the Zeffo merely understand the Force? Why not command it absolutely? Why should they seek harmony with natural forces when they could dominate those forces, bend them to serve Zephonian purposes? Why should they learn from other species when they clearly possessed superior understanding and abilities? Kujet began to preach a new philosophy. The life wind shouldn't be respected and studied. It should be controlled, harnessed, and directed according to the will of those powerful enough to do so. The strongest Force users should rule absolutely, their power giving them the right to command lesser beings. Other species weren't partners or sources of alternative wisdom. They were resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. True mastery of the Force meant perfect control, not harmony, domination, not balance. This was the dark side speaking, of course, though the Zeffo didn't have that terminology. They hadn't encountered the Sith. They didn't know about the ancient wars between light and dark that had shaped earlier galactic history. They were developing their own understanding of the Force, and in Kujet, they were learning the hard way that power without restraint inevitably leads to corruption. The dark side promises strength, control, the ability to impose your will on reality itself. It delivers on those promises, at least in the short term, but it takes far more than it gives, corrupting not just the individual who embraces it, but spreading outward to poison entire societies. Kujet didn't establish a palace on Zeffo. That would have been too limiting, too subject to the oversight and potential resistance of other Zeffo who remembered the old ways. Instead, this corrupt sage chose Dathomir as a seat of power. This planet, drenched in dark side energy, served as both a power source and a statement. On Dathomir, surrounded by the planet's malevolent force presence, Kujet could pursue the darkest aspects of Force study without interference. The Night Sisters who inhabited the planet were either intimidated into submission or found common cause with Kujet's approach to power. From this isolated throne, Kujet issued a decree that revealed how far into darkness the sage had fallen. The astriums, sacred objects central to Zeffo religious practice, were to be destroyed. These circular artifacts served multiple functions in Zeffo society. They were keys to important sites, tools for Force-based rituals, symbols of the connection between sages and the people they served. By ordering their destruction, Kujet was systematically dismantling the infrastructure of traditional Zeffo culture. Future generations wouldn't be able to access certain tombs or temples. They wouldn't be able to perform the rituals that connected them to their history. They would be dependent on Kujet and Kujet's followers for any access to deeper understanding of the Force. This was the ultimate expression of control. Kujet wasn't just ruling the Zeffo. Kujet was remaking their civilization into something unrecognizable, something that existed solely to serve the sage's will. And when portions of the Zeffo population resisted, when brave souls stood up to declare that this wasn't what their civilization was meant to be, Kujet's response was swift and brutal. The tomb of Kujet on Dathomir bears silent witness to the massacre that followed. Rebels were brought before the sage and cast into the pits beneath the palace. Others were frozen in stone through some terrible application of force power, their bodies preserved in eternal agony as warnings to anyone else who might consider resistance. The corruption was complete. A civilization that had begun with principles of harmony and balance had become a tyranny ruled by fear. The sages, once respected guides and teachers, had become something monstrous in Kujet's image, and the life wind, understood for centuries as something to be reverenced and worked with gently, had been reduced to just another tool for oppression. The age of the sages had led inevitably to this darkness, because they had forgotten or never learned the most important lesson. power without accountability, ability without humility, mastery without wisdom. These always lead to the same destination. It doesn't matter how noble your intentions were at the start. It doesn't matter how wise your teachers or how sophisticated your philosophy. If you value power more than principle, you will eventually fall. Architectural marvels and technology. To truly understand the Zeffo, we need to examine what they built. Their temples and tombs aren't just impressive ruins, they're functioning demonstrations of how the Zeffo understood the relationship between the physical universe and the Force. These structures reveal a civilization that had achieved something remarkable: the seamless integration of technology and Force abilities, creating architecture that was simultaneously mechanical and mystical. Buildings that served practical purposes while embodying deep philosophical principles. The Zeffo approach to construction was fundamentally different from what we see in most other civilizations. They didn't build structures and then add Force-sensitive components as afterthoughts. They designed buildings from the ground up to work with the Force, to channel it, amplify it, and make it accessible even to those with limited Force sensitivity. A Zeffo temple wasn't just a place where Force users gathered. It was an active tool for developing Force abilities, an architectural expression of their understanding of how the life wind flowed through reality. Consider the wind mechanics incorporated into virtually every Zeffo structure. These weren't simple ventilation systems. They were carefully engineered networks of passages and chambers designed to create specific air current patterns. Wind entered through openings positioned to catch the electromagnetic air currents unique to their environments. It flowed through channels carved at precise angles, building velocity or dispersing into gentle breezes depending on the intended effect. In meditation chambers, the wind moved in slow, regular cycles, its rhythm helping practitioners achieve the mental states necessary for deep Force connection. In training areas, the wind became a tool and obstacle, creating forces that students had to work with or overcome using their Force abilities. The Temple of Eilram showcases this mastery of wind manipulation at its finest. Throughout the structure, enormous spheres must be moved and positioned to solve puzzles that grant access to deeper levels. But these spheres don't just move because someone uses the Force to push them. They're designed to interact with the wind currents flowing through the temple. A sphere positioned in one location catches the wind and swings like a pendulum, creating a moving platform that allows access to previously unreachable areas. The same sphere moved to a different position channels wind into a new section of the temple, activating mechanisms that have remained dormant for millennia. This created a brilliant training system. Young Force users couldn't simply batter their way through Zeffo temples using raw power. They had to think, had to observe, had to understand how their Force abilities could work in harmony with natural and mechanical forces. Push a sphere too hard, and you'd send it careening out of position, rendering the puzzle unsolvable. Don't push it enough, and it wouldn't move into place. The precise application of force, the careful observation of how wind and weight and momentum interacted, these were the skills the temples taught. And because the puzzles remained functional for thousands of years after the Zeffo disappeared, they continued teaching these lessons to anyone who entered them. A curriculum carved in stone and sustained by energy fields that defied time's erosion. The energy spheres themselves represent one of the Zeffo's most impressive technological achievements. These bronze-hued devices, ranging from small orbs that could be held in one hand to massive constructs several meters in diameter, were simultaneously batteries, conductors, and focusing implements for force energy. The Zeffo had discovered how to create metal alloys that resonated with the Force, materials that could store force energy the way a battery stores electricity. When these spheres were positioned correctly within a temple's energy network, they powered lights that never dimmed, activated mechanisms that moved massive stone blocks, and maintained force-sensitive fields that preserved artifacts from decay. But more impressively, these spheres remained responsive to force manipulation even after millennia of dormancy. A Jedi like Cal Kestis, visiting Zeffo temples thousands of years after they were abandoned, could still use the Force to move these spheres, activate the systems they powered, and solve the puzzles they were part of. This suggests the Zeffo had achieved an understanding of force-matter interaction that even the Jedi of the Old Republic hadn't fully grasped. They weren't just building machines that Force users could operate. They were building machines that were themselves partially force-sensitive, able to distinguish between random physical contact and intentional force manipulation, responding only to the latter. This principle extended to their most impressive creations, the Tomb Guardians. These automatons represent the pinnacle of Zeffo technological and force-based engineering. Constructed to protect sacred sites, the Tomb Guardians were designed to remain active indefinitely, powered by internal energy spheres that drew sustenance from the Force itself. They're humanoid in basic shape, clearly modeled after the Zeffo form, but larger, more imposing, built from metal and stone to withstand the ages. Their faces are featureless masks, giving them an intimidating, impersonal quality. They don't attack out of malice or aggression. They respond to programmed parameters, assessing threats and neutralizing them with mechanical efficiency. The Guardians' most remarkable feature is their power cores, energy spheres embedded in their central torsos. These cores power the automatons and serve as their primary vulnerability. When a Guardian prepares to unleash one of its more powerful attacks, the core begins to glow, pulsing with accumulated energy. A skilled Force user can exploit this moment, using a push or pull to extract the sphere, momentarily shutting down the Guardian and leaving it vulnerable to physical attack. This wasn't a flaw in their design. It was intentional, a way of ensuring that only someone with both force sensitivity and tactical understanding could permanently deactivate these protectors. You had to prove your worth not just through power, but through observation and timing. The Tomb Guardians were designed to last, and last they did. When Eno Cordova explored Zeffo temples during the Clone Wars era, he encountered active Guardians that had been standing watch for untold millennia. When Cal Kestis arrived 5 years after Order 66, those same Guardians still functioned. They had survived the fall of the Zeffo civilization, the rise and fall of multiple galactic governments, technological ages coming and going. They represented a level of engineering that made them essentially eternal, immune to the decay that claimed lesser machines. The fact that they still posed a legitimate threat to skilled Force users thousands of years after their creation speaks to how thoroughly the Zeffo understood both combat dynamics and long-term system maintenance. The tombs themselves were marvels of preservation technology. Sarcophagi remained sealed by Force-maintained fields that prevented atmosphere from reaching the contents. Murals and inscriptions that should have eroded into illegibility remained crisp and clear. Even organic materials like fabrics and woods were found intact in some chambers, protected by stasis fields that the Zeffo had somehow powered indefinitely. This wasn't magic or mysticism. It was sophisticated application of Force principles to practical problems. The Zeffo had learned to create standing wave patterns in the Force, stable configurations of energy that could persist without active maintenance, drawing power from the ambient Force energy that permeates all space. Their approach to information storage was equally advanced. Zeffo writing appeared not just as simple inscriptions, but as multi-layered glyphs that revealed different information depending on how they were viewed. Some inscriptions could only be fully read by someone Force-sensitive, the complete meaning emerging only when the observer opened themselves to perceiving Force impressions layered into the physical text. This created a natural security system. Critical information remained hidden from those who lacked Force abilities, while basic historical and cultural information remained accessible to anyone who learned to read the Zeffo language. The astriums, those sacred artifacts that Kujet tried to destroy, represented the culmination of Zeffo Force technology integration. These circular devices were simultaneously religious symbols, practical tools, and sophisticated Force-resonant computers. An astrium could serve as a key to activate specific Zeffo mechanisms, but only when held by someone Force-sensitive. The device would attune itself to the user's Force signature, creating a unique authentication that prevented unauthorized access to important sites. An astrium could also serve as a focusing implement for certain Force techniques. Its perfectly balanced construction and Force-infused materials helping to channel and amplify the user's abilities. But perhaps most remarkably, astriums seem to contain embedded information, recordings of knowledge or experiences that could be accessed through Force connection. When Cal Kestis finally obtained an astrium and used it to access the Bogano Vault, the device didn't just unlock a door. It interfaced with the Vault's systems to provide Cal with visions, Force impressions, of what the Vault was meant to protect, and why. This suggests the astriums were storage devices for Force memories,
allowing Zeffo sages to
preserve their wisdom in a form that could only be accessed by Force users, ensuring that critical knowledge wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. The architectural philosophy underlying all of this was deeply holistic. The Zeffo didn't separate the spiritual from the practical, the mystical from the mechanical. To them, these were all aspects of the same underlying reality. The Force flowed through everything, and understanding how it flowed allowed you to build structures that worked in harmony with those flows. A temple wasn't just a building where worship happened. It was an instrument for generating specific Force effects, as carefully tuned as any musical instrument. The placement of chambers, the angles of passages, the materials chosen for construction, all of these decisions contributed to creating environments where the Force became more accessible, more perceivable, more responsive to those who sought connection with it. This holistic approach extended to their urban planning as well. The few Zeffo settlements that have been studied show careful consideration for how the life wind flowed through populated areas. Streets weren't laid out in simple grids, but followed curves and angles designed to channel wind in beneficial ways. Public spaces were positioned at intersection points where multiple air currents met, creating zones of turbulent energy that the Zeffo believed enhanced creativity and community bonding. Residential areas were placed in calmer zones where the wind moved more gently, providing peaceful environments for rest and family life. The Zeffo also demonstrated remarkable skill in adapting their architectural principles to different planetary environments. The temples on Bogano, a world quite different from their wind-swept homeworld, incorporated the local ecology into their designs. The enormous vault built into Bogano's mesa wasn't just carved from rock. It was designed to work with the natural cave systems already present in the formation, expanding and modifying them rather than creating entirely artificial spaces. This required deep understanding of geology, structural engineering, and how Force energy flowed through different types of stone and mineral deposits. On Kashyyyk, Zeffo structures had to account for the massive Roshir trees and the complex ecosystem they supported. Rather than clearing forest to create building sites, the Zeffo incorporated living trees into their architecture, creating hybrid structures where Zeffo construction techniques merged seamlessly with the natural growth of the forest. This approach showed respect for the world they were building on and demonstrated their core belief that civilization should work with nature rather than dominating it. At least, that was the belief before Kujet corrupted everything. The level of mathematical sophistication required for all of this cannot be overstated. The Zeffo were working with forces that couldn't be directly measured with instruments, flows of energy that existed partially in dimensions beyond the purely physical. They had to develop entirely new branches of mathematics to model Force behavior, to predict how changes in physical architecture would affect Force currents, to calculate the precise angles and dimensions needed to create the effects they desired. Some of their inscriptions are clearly mathematical in nature, complex equations and geometric diagrams that even Jedi scholars struggled to fully understand. The Zeffo weren't just Force users. They were theoretical physicists working with a physics that included consciousness and intention as fundamental forces alongside gravity and electromagnetism. Their lighting technology alone would have seemed miraculous to less advanced civilizations. The eternal flames in Miktrull's tomb, the softly glowing panels that illuminated passage walls, the energy fields that created barriers of pure light, all of these were powered by their understanding of how to convert force energy into photons. They had essentially created fusion reactors that ran on the Force itself, self-sustaining systems that would continue functioning as long as the Force permeated the universe, which is to say, forever. No fuel needed replacing, no maintenance required, just perfect, eternal illumination powered by the fundamental energy of existence itself. The preservation of their knowledge through all of this was equally impressive. While much was lost when the Zeffo fled their territories, they left behind enough that dedicated scholars could piece together significant portions of their history and understanding. The combination of written records, Force impressions embedded in significant objects, and the functioning examples of their technology created multiple redundant systems for knowledge transfer. Even if someone couldn't read Zeffo script, they could learn by studying how the machines worked. Even if the machines were destroyed, the written records preserved the principles. And even if both text and technology were lost, Force-sensitive individuals could perceive echoes of Zeffo understanding embedded in the Force itself at their sacred sites. This multi-layered approach to knowledge preservation suggests the Zeffo understood that civilizations fall. They knew that their advanced understanding might be lost, that future generations might lack the context to fully grasp what they'd achieved. So they built redundancy into everything, creating multiple pathways through which their wisdom could survive and eventually be recovered. In doing so, they ensured that even after their civilization's complete collapse, even after millennia of abandonment and decay, individuals like Eno Cordova and Cal Kestis could still access enough information to understand what the Zeffo had been and what they'd accomplished. The tragedy is that all of this sophistication, all of this careful engineering and philosophical depth couldn't save them from themselves. The very temples and technologies that represented their greatest achievements became monuments to their failure. These structures that were meant to help people connect with the Force ended up standing empty, their puzzles unsolved for thousands of years, their guardians protecting tombs that no living Zeffo would ever visit. The civilization that had achieved such mastery over blending technology and mysticism couldn't master the one thing that ultimately mattered, preventing the corruption of their own ideals by those who valued power over wisdom. We need to examine Kujet's reign in detail because it represents the crucial turning point, the moment when Zeffo civilization crossed from achievement into atrocity. Understanding how this happened how a single individual could corrupt an entire sophisticated civilization provides insights not just into Zeffo history, but into the broader pattern of how Force-sensitive societies fail. The fall of the Zeffo wasn't unique. We see similar patterns throughout galactic history, even with what happened to the Jedi Order. Power corrupts, and Force power corrupts in particularly devastating ways because it gives individuals the ability to impose their will on reality itself. Kujet's rise to prominence appears to have been gradual, based on what can be pieced together from inscriptions and Force echoes. The historical record suggests this sage initially may have presented as someone with the Zeffo's best interests at heart, but Kujet's vision for the Zeffo was revisionist, reinterpreting their philosophy to emphasize dominance and control while downplaying the harmony and balance that had actually characterized their earlier culture. The initial changes Kujet advocated seemed modest: greater organization of Force training, more systematic approaches to developing abilities, increased focus on practical applications of Force powers rather than pure contemplation. Who could argue with wanting to be more effective, more organized, more practical? But these changes, seemingly innocent on the surface, created the infrastructure for what would follow. Centralized training meant centralized control over what was taught. Systematic approaches allowed for standardization, which meant anyone who deviated from approved methods could be identified and corrected. Focus on practical application over contemplation shifted the culture away from wisdom toward mere power. Kujet also began emphasizing hierarchy more explicitly. The Zeffo had always recognized that some individuals were more Force-sensitive than others, but they'd maintained the principle that everyone had value, that even those with modest abilities contributed meaningfully to their civilization. Kujet started preaching a different message. The strong should rule. Those with greater Force power had not just ability, but right, even obligation, to control those with less. This wasn't cruelty, Kujet argued. It was natural order. The life wind flowed more strongly through some individuals, and those individuals were meant to direct the course of civilization. This philosophy found receptive audiences among certain Zeffo, particularly younger sages who had grown up in an era of prosperity and had never experienced the challenges that had taught their ancestors the value of humility. They liked the idea that their power meant something more than just enhanced perception. They wanted to matter, to have authority that matched their abilities. Kujet gave them permission to embrace their superiority, to stop pretending that the Force blind had equal value. It was seductive, flattering, and utterly corrosive to the principles that had built Zeffo civilization. The establishment of Kujet's stronghold on Dathomir marked the point where corruption became overt tyranny. By choosing this dark side saturated world, Kujet made a statement. This sage wasn't interested in working within Zeffo society's existing structures. Dathomir would be a new center, a place where Kujet's vision could be implemented without compromise. The planet itself served as both tool and symbol. Its natural dark side energies would have amplified Kujet's power, while simultaneously corrupting any followers who spent extended time there. The architecture Kujet created on Dathomir reflected the changed philosophy, where earlier Zeffo structures emphasized openness and flow. Kujet's fortress was oppressive and dominating. Massive stone blocks were stacked into walls that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inspire. Chambers were carved deep underground, removed from natural light and air, spaces where darkness could pool undisturbed. The entire complex was built to amplify dark side energy, to make rage and fear and the hunger for power feel natural and justified. Anyone who spent time in these spaces found their darker impulses strengthened, their capacity for compassion and restraint weakened. The decree ordering destruction of the Astriums revealed Kujet's true nature to those who had somehow missed the earlier warning signs. These sacred objects represented connection to traditional Zeffo values, to the wisdom of earlier sages, to a time before power became the only thing that mattered. By destroying them, Kujet was attempting to erase history itself, to make it impossible for future generations to access the teachings that might challenge Kujet's authority. Only a few Astriums survived, hidden by those who recognized what was happening and refused to comply. But it was the response to resistance that showed how completely Kujet had fallen. When portions of Zeffo society rejected Kujet's authority, when groups of traditionalists tried to preserve the original values of their civilization, Kujet's answer was massacre. Resistors were hunted down and brought to Dathomir in chains. Some were executed outright, their bodies cast into pits beneath the fortress. Others were subjected to worse fates, transformed through dark-side alchemy into twisted creatures that served as both slaves and warnings. The most defiant were frozen in stone, their bodies preserved in positions of agony, forever displaying the price of opposing Kujet's will. The rebels who opposed Kujet met terrible fates. Those who dared to stand against the sage's tyranny were massacred in the halls of his palace. The bodies of these brave resistors were frozen in place, preserved in their final moments of agony, their forms clawing at the walls in desperate attempts to escape. These frozen figures remained in the tomb for millennia, testament to Kujet's cruelty. When Cal Kestis eventually explored the tomb, he could sense their lingering anguish, force echoes of suffering so intense that they had imprinted on the physical location itself. Kujet's corruption extended to the understanding of the life wind itself. The sage preached that the Force wasn't something to work in harmony with, but something to dominate and control. The strongest will should be able to bend the Force to serve any purpose, regardless of whether that purpose aligned with natural order or cosmic balance. This philosophy, drawn from the dark side, led to experiments in force manipulation, that previous Zeffo would have considered abominations. The connection between Kujet's fortress on Dathomir and the planet Peridia is one of the most intriguing discoveries. We know from inscriptions found in the Ahsoka series that Peridia, a planet in another galaxy entirely, bears Zephonian runes praising Kujet as ruler of all and hoping for an everlasting reign. This suggests Kujet's influence extended far beyond the known galaxy, though the exact nature of this connection and how it was established remains a mystery. The possibility that Kujet explored or even ruled over territories in another galaxy suggests this sage's power and ambition exceeded what the ruins in the primary galaxy demonstrate. The psychological impact of Kujet's reign on Zeffo civilization cannot be overstated. This wasn't just political tyranny or military conquest. It was the corruption of everything their culture held sacred. The life wind, which had been understood as a force for connection and understanding, became a tool for oppression. The sages, who had been guides and teachers, became tyrants and executioners. The temples and tombs, built to help people develop their force abilities through wisdom and patience, were repurposed as strongholds for Kujet's followers, or sealed off so that only those loyal to the new regime could access them. The truly insidious aspect of Kujet's corruption was how it poisoned the Zeffo's self-image. They had believed themselves to be wise, balanced, and noble. They had thought their sophisticated understanding of the Force made them superior to less enlightened civilizations. But Kujet revealed that all their wisdom and sophistication couldn't prevent the rise of a tyrant who exploited the very systems they'd created to teach wisdom. Their hierarchical structure, built on the assumption that the most force-sensitive individuals would naturally be the wisest, collapsed when someone powerful enough but lacking in wisdom claimed authority. Their trust in the life wind to guide them toward right action failed when someone interpreted the Force's power as justification for any action. Those Zeffo who recognized what was happening faced impossible choices. They could resist and face certain death or fates worse than death. They could flee, abandoning their homeworld and sacred sites to Kujet's control, or they could submit, preserving their lives at the cost of their principles. Many chose resistance and paid the price. Others fled to remote locations trying to preserve traditional Zeffo culture in exile. Some submitted, rationalizing that they could work within the system to moderate its worst excesses, though this rationalization rarely proved valid. The environmental impact of Kujet's reign extended even to the physical locations under this sage's control. Dathomir had always been saturated with dark side energy, but Kujet's presence intensified it. The fortress became a wound in the Force, a location where the boundary between the physical world and the dark side dimensions grew thin. Similar corruption spread to other sites Kujet controlled. The natural balance that earlier Zeffo had worked so hard to maintain was shattered, replaced by twisted energy flows that would persist long after Kujet's death. What finally brought down Kujet? The records are frustratingly unclear on this point. We know the sage died on Dathomir and was entombed in the fortress built there. We know that by the time of Kujet's death, Zeffo's civilization was already irreversibly damaged, but the specific circumstances of Kujet's end remain mysterious. Did other sages finally unite to defeat their corrupted peer? Did Kujet's experiments with forbidden force techniques finally backfire? Or did this tyrant simply die of old age after decades of oppression? The damage already done regardless. What's clear is that Kujet's death didn't reverse the corruption. By the time this sage was gone, an entire generation of Zeffo had grown up under the regime, knowing only Kujet's interpretation of what their civilization should be. The traditional understanding of the life wind had been suppressed for so long that fewer and fewer Zeffo remembered it clearly. The infrastructure of tyranny, once established, proved difficult to dismantle. Even with Kujet gone, the civilization couldn't simply return to what it had been. Too much had changed. Too much had been destroyed. The tomb built for Kujet on Dathomir stands as perhaps the perfect monument to this sage's legacy. It's oppressive and threatening, built to showcase power rather than inspire contemplation. The stone prisoners line the passages, eternal witnesses to Kujet's cruelty. The dark side energy saturating every chamber makes clear what philosophy guided this sage's actions. And at the heart of it, in a chamber deep underground, Kujet's sarcophagus rests, surrounded by the implements of dark side rituals, artifacts used in experiments that twisted the Force toward purposes it was never meant to serve. When Cal Kestis eventually explored this tomb thousands of years later, he could feel the lingering malevolence, the echo of Kujet's will trying to impose itself even from beyond death. The entire structure was a trap, a final expression of Kujet's contempt for anyone who might come seeking understanding. The sage had designed it to test intruders, to force them through trials that required embracing dark side emotions to overcome. Only by resisting these temptations, by finding paths that didn't require rage or hatred, could Cal navigate the tomb successfully. In death as in life, Kujet tried to corrupt those who encountered this sage's legacy. The shadow Kujet cast over Zeffo civilization was absolute and permanent. Even after this sage's death, even after the Zeffo fled their territories entirely, Kujet's corruption persisted. It persisted in the ruins left behind, in the dark side energy that saturated former Zeffo sites, in the warnings inscribed by those who finally understood what had gone wrong. The Zeffo had achieved greatness and then allowed one individual's hunger for power to destroy everything they'd built. It was a cautionary tale, carved in stone and silence, waiting for anyone wise enough to learn from it. The Fall and Exodus. The death of Kujet didn't bring salvation to the Zeffo. If anything, it may have accelerated their decline because the tyranny had at least provided structure, however twisted. With Kujet gone, the civilization fractured completely. Different factions emerged, each claiming to represent the true path forward. Some wanted to continue Kujet's philosophy, believing that power and control were the answers to their problems. Others sought to return to traditional values, trying to resurrect the wisdom of Eilram and the earlier sages. Most were simply trying to survive in a civilization that was tearing itself apart. The corruption Kujet had introduced didn't disappear with the sage's death. Dark side influence doesn't work like that. Once you've taught an entire generation that power justifies any action, once you've shown them that the Force can be used to dominate and control, you can't simply unteach those lessons. The Zeffo who had grown up under Kujet's regime had internalized these values. They'd seen that the strongest Force users could impose their will on everyone else, and many of them wanted to be those strong ones, rather than finding a way to dismantle the hierarchy entirely. Internal conflicts erupted. Rival sages battled for supremacy, each claiming legitimate authority to lead the civilization forward. These weren't philosophical debates or political disagreements resolved through dialogue. They were force-powered conflicts where mountains shook and storms raged as combatants threw everything they had at each other. The Zeffo homeworld bore the scars of these battles. Sections of once proud cities lay in ruins, blasted apart by Force lightning or crushed by stones torn from the ground and hurled with telekinetic fury. The population that hadn't already fled found themselves caught in the crossfire. Civilians suffering the consequences of decisions made by those too powerful and too corrupted to care about collateral damage. The technology that had been the Zeffo's pride became weapons in these conflicts. Energy spheres designed to power temples were reprogrammed to explode with devastating force. Tomb Guardians were commanded to attack other Zeffo rather than defending sacred sites. Even the architecture itself became weaponized as Force users collapsed structures on their enemies or activated ancient defensive mechanisms that had been meant to protect against external threats. The civilization was consuming itself, turning all of its accumulated wisdom and capability toward self-destruction. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the decline was the loss of knowledge. In the chaos of civil war and fragmentation, the systematic transmission of understanding broke down. Temples that had served as schools for countless generations were abandoned or destroyed. Master crafters died without passing on their techniques. Philosophical texts were lost in fires or deliberately destroyed by factions who disagreed with their content. The Zeffo had spent millennia accumulating wisdom, building on the achievements of each generation, creating an ever deeper understanding of the Force and how it interacted with the physical universe. In just a few chaotic decades, much of that accumulated knowledge evaporated. Those Zeffo who retained some degree of wisdom and stability began to recognize an uncomfortable truth. Their civilization couldn't be saved. The corruption was too deep, the factional conflicts too bitter, the loss of shared values too complete. The question wasn't whether Zeffo civilization would fall, but whether anything could be preserved from the wreckage. Could they save at least some portion of their culture, some fraction of their people, some echo of what they had been before Kujet's corruption poisoned everything? The decision to flee must have been agonizing. The Zeffo were being asked to abandon their homeworld, the planet where their species had evolved and their culture had first emerged. They would leave behind their temples, their tombs, the sacred sites where generations of their ancestors had sought connection with the life wind. They would surrender territories they'd expanded into over centuries, admitting defeat not to an external enemy, but to their own failures. For a proud civilization that had believed themselves to be wise and enlightened, this was a devastating blow to their collective identity. But stay they could not. The conflicts were intensifying. The dark side corruption was spreading. The infrastructure necessary to maintain an advanced civilization was collapsing. Food production suffered as agricultural workers fled conflict zones or were caught in battles. Supply chains that connected different Zeffo settlements broke down. Even basic order was deteriorating in many areas. The choice became clear: flee and perhaps preserve something, or remain and certainly perish. The preparations for exodus were complicated by the simple fact that there was no unified Zeffo civilization anymore to organize such a massive undertaking. Different groups made their own decisions about where to go and how to get there. Some had ships, either Zeffo-built vessels or foreign craft obtained through trade. Others used their force abilities to construct vessels from whatever materials they could gather, creating ships that were as much force artifacts as machines. The Exodus wasn't a single organized departure, but a gradual bleeding away of population as group after group decided they had to leave. Before they left, some Zeffo took steps to preserve what they could of their civilization's achievements. They sealed important chambers in their temples, hiding artifacts that might be valuable to future generations or dangerous in the wrong hands. They created inscriptions warning about what had happened, hoping that someday someone would find these warnings and learn from Zeffo mistakes. Some of these warnings were straightforward historical accounts. Others were more cryptic, encoded in layers of meaning that would only reveal themselves to force-sensitive readers who approached with the right intentions. The message left by one of the final sages, possibly Kujet's immediate successor, or someone who lived shortly after the tyrant's death, is particularly poignant. This sage recognized that their civilization had failed fundamentally, They had achieved mastery over the Force, but lacked the wisdom to prevent that mastery from corrupting them. The inscription warns future Force users not to repeat Zeffo mistakes, to remember that power without restraint inevitably leads to destruction. It's a message of regret and hope, mourning what was lost while trying to ensure that the loss wasn't meaningless, that someone might learn something from the ruins they left behind. The actual departure point for most Zeffo appears to have been their home world, though some groups left from other territories. They set course for the unknown regions, that vast expanse of space beyond the edges of known galactic civilization. This choice makes sense for several reasons. The unknown regions were largely unmapped and unexplored, providing places where the Zeffo could potentially hide and rebuild without interference. The difficult navigation and dangerous conditions that made the unknown regions challenging for most species might actually benefit a civilization of Force users who could use their abilities to sense safe paths through hazardous space. But there was likely another factor in choosing this destination. The unknown regions were known to harbor Force-sensitive phenomena and ancient mysteries. For a civilization based on understanding the Force, this made the region attractive despite its dangers. Perhaps they hoped to find places of power where they could deepen their understanding. Perhaps they sought isolation, believing that distance from other civilizations would prevent future corruption. Or perhaps they simply wanted to flee as far as possible from the sites of their failures, from the planets that reminded them of what they'd lost. What happened to the Zeffo in the unknown regions remains one of the great mysteries of the Star Wars galaxy. They disappeared so completely that by the time of the Galactic Republic's peak, most beings had never heard of them. Their territories were abandoned for so long that their temples became legend, places of mystery that few could identify as the work of a specific civilization. The Zeffo vanished from history so thoroughly that when Eno Cordova began piecing together their story during the Clone Wars, he was essentially rediscovering a lost civilization that had been forgotten for thousands of years. Several theories exist about the Zeffo's fate. The optimistic interpretation is that they successfully established themselves in the unknown regions, rebuilt their civilization with hard-won wisdom about the dangers of unchecked power, and continued to exist far from the conflicts that would eventually engulf the known galaxy. By this theory, the Zeffo might still exist out there somewhere, a civilization that learned from its mistakes and chose isolation over the risks of contact with other cultures. A darker possibility is that the conflicts that destroyed their original civilization followed them into exile. The factional divisions, the dark side corruption, the inability to agree on fundamental values. These problems wouldn't simply disappear because they moved to a new location. The Zeffo who fled might have carried the seeds of destruction with them, eventually consuming themselves in the unknown regions just as they had in their original territories. By this interpretation, the Exodus didn't save them, but simply relocated their decline to somewhere no one would witness it. Another theory suggests the Zeffo encountered something in the unknown regions that finished what Kujet started. The unknown regions are home to dangerous phenomena and hostile entities. Perhaps the weakened, fractured remnants of Zeffo civilization simply couldn't survive the challenges they encountered. Or perhaps they encountered another Force-sensitive civilization or dark side entity that viewed them as threats or resources to be exploited. The unknown regions have swallowed countless exploration missions and entire civilizations. The Zeffo might be just another entry in that long list of the disappeared. There's also the possibility that the Zeffo didn't go extinct but transformed into something else. Force-sensitive civilizations don't always follow linear paths. The intensive use of Force abilities, especially dark side powers, can cause biological changes across generations. The Zeffo who entered the unknown regions might have evolved or devolved into something no longer recognizable as the civilization that built the temples on Bogano and Zeffo. Their descendants might exist, but be so changed that the connection to their ancestors is no longer visible. What we can say with certainty is that by the time the Galactic Republic explored the regions where Zeffo territories had existed, there were no living Zeffo to be found. Their temples stood empty. Their tombs were sealed. Their cities had crumbled into ruins that most couldn't even identify as artificial structures. Nature had reclaimed much of what they'd built, vines growing through carefully carved passages, water pooling in chambers meant for meditation, wind howling through empty halls where Force users had once studied and practiced. The abandonment was so complete that even their tomb guardians, those eternal automatons designed to protect Zeffo sites indefinitely, stood watch over places no Zeffo would ever visit again. These machines continued to fulfill their programming, attacking intruders who entered their assigned territories, but they were protecting tombs that had become orphaned. The sages they guarded had no living civilization to return to their wisdom. The temples they maintained had no students coming to learn. The guardians had become ghosts haunting ruins, eternal protectors of a dead civilization's empty monuments. For the few Zeffo who might have remained behind, either by choice or because they lacked the means to flee, the end came slowly and sadly. Cut off from the broader civilization, without the infrastructure and community that had supported their way of life, these remnants would have struggled to survive. Perhaps some lasted for decades or even centuries in isolated settlements, but without the critical mass of knowledge and capability that sustained Zeffo civilization, they were doomed. The last Zeffo died alone, or in small groups, taking with them personal memories and understandings that no inscriptions preserved, knowledge that would be lost forever when their minds fell silent. The fall of the Zeffo civilization demonstrates a pattern that appears throughout galactic history. Achievement leads to pride. Pride leads to the belief that rules don't apply to you because you're special. That belief creates vulnerability to corruption. Corruption spreads until it destroys the very foundations that allowed the achievement in the first place. The cycle appears inevitable once started, as if civilizations carry within them the seeds of their own destruction from the moment they begin believing their greatness makes them immune to the dangers that destroyed lesser societies. The Zeffo story ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not with a climactic final battle, but with gradual abandonment and slow fade into obscurity. They left behind warnings carved in stone, wisdom encoded in their technology, and echoes of their presence imprinted in the Force at sites they once held sacred. But they left as people who had failed, who had achieved greatness and then squandered it, who had understood profound truths about the Force, but couldn't prevent those truths from being twisted toward terrible purposes. They left, and the galaxy forgot them, and their ruins waited in silence for someone to find them, and perhaps, just perhaps, learn from their mistakes. Eno Cordova's quest, thousands of years after the Zeffo fled into the unknown regions, their empty temples still stood. Time had weathered them, but not destroyed them. The sophisticated construction techniques and force-sustained preservation fields meant that much remained intact, waiting for someone curious and capable enough to explore them. That someone was Jedi Master Eno Cordova, a scholar and archaeologist who specialized in studying ancient force-sensitive civilizations. Cordova's investigation of the Zeffo would become one of the most significant archaeological undertakings of the late Republic era, and his findings would prove crucial to the survival of the Jedi Order after its near destruction. Eno Cordova wasn't a typical Jedi Master. While certainly capable in combat and accomplished in traditional Jedi disciplines, his passion lay in understanding the Force's history and how different civilizations across the millennia had perceived and utilized it. He believed that the Jedi Order, for all its wisdom and longevity, didn't have a monopoly on Force understanding. Other cultures, other species, other philosophical traditions might have insights that could complement or even challenge Jedi doctrine. This openness to learning from the past made Cordova uniquely suited to studying the Zeffo, and it would ultimately lead him to conclusions that more orthodox Jedi might have dismissed. Cordova's first encounter with Zeffo ruins appears to have occurred on Bogano, a remote world in the Outer Rim that had remained largely unexplored during the Republic's expansion. Bogano was a strange planet, its ecology dominated by massive creatures, and its landscape shaped by the enormous vault that the Zeffo had built into one of its mesas. Local legends spoke of the vault as a place of power, somewhere that shouldn't be disturbed. Most treasure hunters and explorers who investigated these legends found the vault's entrance, but couldn't progress further without Force abilities, ensuring that its contents remained secure. When Cordova arrived on Bogano, probably sometime during the Clone Wars or shortly before, he brought both the force sensitivity needed to access Zeffo sites and the scholarly mindset required to understand what he found. The Bogano Vault became his entry point into Zeffo civilization as he explored its passages, solved its puzzles, and studied its inscriptions. Cordova began piecing together the story of a civilization that had existed long before the Jedi Order reached prominence. The realization of what he'd discovered must have been exhilarating. Here was evidence of a force-sensitive culture that had achieved technological and philosophical sophistication matching or exceeding what the Republic had accomplished. But Cordova didn't stop with Bogano. As he translated more Zeffo inscriptions and understood more of their history, he realized that their civilization had extended across multiple worlds. References in Bogano's vault pointed to other sites, other temples where additional pieces of the puzzle could be found. Cordova became driven to understand the full scope of Zeffo achievement, and perhaps more importantly, to understand what had happened to them. A civilization this advanced didn't simply vanish without reason. Something catastrophic must have occurred, and Cordova wanted to know what. His research took him to Zeffo, the species' homeworld. Here he found ruins on a much grander scale than what Bogano offered. Entire cities, though partially buried and overgrown, still showed evidence of sophisticated urban planning. The tomb of Eilram provided insight into Zeffo culture during its golden age, showing a civilization that valued wisdom, cross-cultural exchange, and harmony with the Force. Cordova spent considerable time in Eilram's tomb, studying the murals, translating inscriptions, and working through the puzzles that the tomb presented. He was learning not just facts about the Zeffo, but understanding their way of thinking, their approach to the Force, their values and priorities. The tomb of Miktrull presented different challenges and different lessons. This structure, more demanding and austere than Eilram's monument, showed Cordova another facet of Zeffo culture: the emphasis on offerings and tests, the requirement that seekers prove their commitment before receiving wisdom. These spoke to a civilization that valued discipline and dedication. The sophisticated integration of force abilities and mechanical systems throughout Miktrull's tomb impressed Cordova deeply. The Zeffo had achieved something the Jedi hadn't really pursued: a seamless blend of technology and force powers, where each enhanced the other. Cordova's journey also took him to Kashyyyk, where Zeffo structures had been built in cooperation with, or at least in respect for, the Wookiee inhabitants and their world. The connection between Eilram and Kashyyyk, recorded in inscriptions and evident in the architectural choices, showed Cordova that the Zeffo at their best had understood the value of learning from other cultures. This aligned with his own beliefs about the importance of remaining open to different approaches to understanding the Force. The Zeffo had been scholars and diplomats, not just mystics isolated in meditation chambers, But as Cordova pieced together more of Zeffo history, he began uncovering darker elements. References to Kujet appeared in later inscriptions, and the tone of these texts was markedly different from the earlier materials, where Eilram and Miktrull were described with reverence and affection. Kujet was written about with fear and barely disguised anger. Cordova found inscriptions warning against Kujet's teachings, urging future generations to remember that the life wind was meant to serve life, not dominate it. He found records of conflicts, of traditional Zeffo values being suppressed, of a civilization fracturing under the weight of corrupted philosophy. The journey to Dathomir must have been particularly difficult for Cordova. This world, notorious for its dark side energy and hostile inhabitants, wasn't somewhere a Jedi visited lightly, but Cordova was committed to understanding the complete Zeffo story, which meant confronting the darkest chapter of their history directly. Kujet's tomb on Dathomir revealed the depths of corruption that had consumed at least one sage, and by extension, influenced the entire civilization. The stone prisoners, the dark side rituals, the oppressive architecture that seemed designed to crush hope and encourage despair. All of this painted a picture of a civilization that had lost its way catastrophically. As Cordova synthesized everything he'd learned across multiple worlds, a complete picture emerged. The Zeffo had achieved greatness through their understanding of the Force, but that same understanding had created vulnerabilities that Kujet exploited. Their hierarchical structure based on Force sensitivity meant that a sufficiently powerful individual could claim authority without adequate checks on their behavior. Their emphasis on mastery and control, however well-intentioned initially, created philosophical foundations that could be twisted toward domination. Their pride in their achievements blinded them to the possibility that they might not be as wise as they thought. The parallels to the Jedi Order must have been uncomfortable for Cordova to contemplate. The Jedi also organized themselves hierarchically based on Force sensitivity and wisdom. They also emphasized mastery and control. Though with different philosophical frameworks, they also took pride in their achievements and their role as galactic peacekeepers. If the Zeffo, with all their sophistication, could fall to corruption and eventual extinction, what did that imply about the Jedi Order's own vulnerabilities? Were the Jedi making the same fundamental mistakes that had doomed the Zeffo? During his research on Zeffo worlds, Cordova experienced something that shook him to his core. He had a vision, a Force impression so powerful that it transcended normal perception. He saw the future, or at least a possible future. He saw the Jedi Temple on Coruscant burning. He saw Jedi Masters and Knights being cut down by clone troopers they had fought alongside. He saw younglings hiding, terrified, as the Order collapsed around them. He saw the destruction of everything the Jedi had built over millennia, a catastrophe that would scatter survivors across the galaxy. Order 66. Cordova didn't know it by that designation, probably didn't understand the specific mechanisms that would bring it about, but he understood the essential truth. The Jedi Order was going to fall. The vision was clear enough on that point. And in the aftermath of that fall, the few survivors would need help. They would need knowledge, guidance, resources, something to help them survive and perhaps eventually rebuild. This vision transformed Cordova's archaeological research from academic exercise into urgent mission. The Zeffo hadn't just left behind ruins and artifacts. They'd left warnings, lessons about what happens when Force-sensitive civilizations become corrupted or complacent. More practically, they'd left behind the vault on Bogano, a secure location that could potentially serve as a repository for information crucial to the Jedi's survival. Cordova began to see his discovery of Zeffo civilization as something more than scholarly achievement. It was opportunity, perhaps providence, a gift from the past that might help the future. Cordova made a decision that would prove controversial if his fellow Jedi had known about it. He began creating a holocron, a sophisticated Force-sensitive data storage device into which he poured everything he'd learned about the Zeffo and, more importantly, information about Force-sensitive children throughout the galaxy. The Jedi maintained records of these children, younglings who showed potential for training. Normally, these records were kept secure on Coruscant. But if Cordova's vision proved accurate, if the temple fell, those records would be lost or captured by whoever destroyed the Order. The holocron Cordova created was attuned specifically to access the vault on Bogano. It contained the instructions for reaching the vault, the astrium needed to open it, and the knowledge necessary to understand what he'd hidden inside. But Cordova built in security measures. The holocron wouldn't reveal its contents to just anyone. It required a Force user with certain qualities, someone who embodied what Cordova believed were the best aspects of Jedi philosophy. Only such an individual could access the information within and make proper use of it. Inside the vault, Cordova hid his most precious discovery, a holocron containing the list of Force-sensitive children scattered across the galaxy. This information would be invaluable to survivors of the Order's fall. It would allow them to find and potentially protect younglings before the Empire could identify and eliminate them. It would provide the foundation for potentially rebuilding the Order, ensuring that Force sensitivity didn't die out with the current generation of Jedi. But in the wrong hands, the list would be catastrophic. The Empire could use it to hunt down every Force-sensitive child in the galaxy, eliminating the possibility of Jedi resurgence before it could begin. Cordova protected this dangerous knowledge with layers of security, inspired by Zeffo methods. The vault itself could only be opened with an astrium. The astrium could only be obtained by someone who successfully navigated Zeffo tombs and proved their worthiness through solving the puzzles and overcoming the challenges these sites presented. Even within the vault, the final chamber required Force abilities and understanding of Zeffo philosophy to access. It was a test designed to ensure that only someone with wisdom, dedication, and genuine commitment to Jedi values could reach what Cordova had hidden. Before Order 66 occurred, while the Clone Wars still raged and the Jedi Order still stood, Cordova shared limited information about his discoveries with his former Padawan, Seer Junda. He gave her his holocron and enough information that she would understand its importance if his vision came to pass. He told her about Bogano, about the vault, about the need to protect Force-sensitive children from whatever catastrophe he'd foreseen. Seer didn't fully understand at the time. The Order seemed strong. The idea that it could fall so completely seemed almost absurd. But she trusted her master, and she kept the holocron safe, even when she didn't fully appreciate why. Cordova's fate after Order 66 remains unclear in the available records. We don't know if he survived the initial purge, if he was among the Jedi who fell when the clones turned on their generals, or if he escaped and lived in hiding somewhere. What we do know is that his preparations proved necessary. The vision was accurate. The Order fell exactly as he'd foreseen. And the holocron he created, the knowledge he'd preserved, the warnings he'd encoded using lessons learned from the Zeffo, all of it would become crucial to the next chapter of this story. Eno Cordova's investigation of the Zeffo civilization stands as one of the most significant archaeological undertakings in galactic history. He recovered knowledge of a Force-sensitive civilization that had been forgotten for millennia. He translated their language, decoded their philosophical frameworks, and understood both their achievements and their failures. He recognized the warnings embedded in their ruins and had the wisdom to apply those warnings to his own Order's situation. And he used Zeffo technology and methods to create a safeguard that might preserve hope for the Jedi's future. The relationship between Cordova and the long-dead Zeffo civilization is poignant in its way. They were reaching across the gulf of thousands of years, a failed civilization leaving messages for future Force users who might learn from their mistakes. Cordova was listening across that same gulf, understanding those messages, and trying to ensure that the Jedi Order didn't repeat Zeffo errors. He couldn't save his own Order from falling, just as the wisest Zeffo couldn't save their civilization. But he could preserve knowledge, protect the vulnerable, and create possibilities for eventual recovery. In doing so, he honored both the Zeffo and the Jedi, taking the best lessons from both traditions and weaving them into something that might survive catastrophe. Cal Kestis and the rediscovery 5 years after Order 66 destroyed the Jedi Order. A young man named Cal Kestis was working as a scrapper on the planet Bracca, hiding his Force sensitivity and trying to survive in a galaxy that had turned hostile to everything he represented. Cal had been a Padawan when the clones turned on the Jedi. His master had died protecting him, and Cal had spent the years since trying to blend in, to become invisible, to suppress the abilities that would mark him for death if discovered. He'd almost succeeded in convincing himself that he was just another worker, that his Jedi past was over and he needed to accept it. But the Force had different plans. A workplace accident forced Cal to use his abilities to save a friend, exposing himself to Imperial observers. Suddenly hunted by the Empire's Inquisitors, Force-sensitive agents dedicated to hunting down surviving Jedi, Cal found himself thrust back into the life he'd tried to leave behind. His rescue came from an unexpected quarter. Seer Junda, former Jedi Knight and Eno Cordova's former Padawan, along with her pilot, Grease Dritus. They'd been searching for a Jedi, any Jedi, who could help them complete a mission that Seer's master had begun years before. Seer explained Cordova's discovery of the Zeffo civilization, though initially, Cal understood only the broad strokes. Ancient Force users, temples on various worlds, a vault containing something important. The specifics didn't matter as much as the central fact. Cordova had found a way to potentially locate Force-sensitive children before the Empire could hunt them down. If Cal could retrieve the holocron from the Bogano vault, they might be able to rebuild the Jedi Order, or at least save the next generation from Imperial purges. Cal's first encounter with Zeffo architecture was on Bogano. The vault dominated the landscape, a massive structure carved into and built upon a mesa. Its entrance was obvious but inaccessible to anyone without Force abilities. Cal had to navigate the mesa's natural caves and passages, using his Force powers to overcome obstacles and reach areas that normal climbing couldn't access. It was his first test, though he didn't necessarily understand it as such. The Zeffo had designed their sites to be accessible only to Force users, and Bogano's terrain, whether naturally or through Zeffo engineering, followed the same principle. The vault itself was unlike anything Cal had seen. The architecture was clearly ancient, but the technology still functioned. Lights activated as he entered. Mechanisms responded to his Force manipulations, and everywhere, there were inscriptions in a language he couldn't read. Symbols and glyphs that spoke of a civilization he knew nothing about. The vault was simultaneously tomb, temple, and testing ground. It challenged Cal to use his Force abilities in ways he hadn't practiced in years, forcing him to remember his training, to trust in powers he'd been suppressing. But Cal quickly discovered he couldn't complete the vault's challenges. He needed an astrium, the circular artifact that served as a key to deeper chambers. Seer, working from Cordova's notes, knew where one could be found. In the tomb of Eilram on Zeffo, the species' homeworld. This meant Cal's journey was just beginning. He would have to visit multiple Zeffo sites, unravel their mysteries, and prove himself worthy of the knowledge they protected. He was following in Cordova's footsteps, but with the added pressure of being hunted by the Empire while doing so. Zeffo, the planet, was a revelation. Here were ruins on a scale that made Bogano's vault look modest. Partially buried cities, massive temples, and everywhere evidence of a civilization that had mastered the integration of technology and Force abilities. Cal explored systematically, following the guidance Seer could provide from Cordova's notes, while also trusting his own Force instincts to guide him towards significant sites.
He encountered tomb guardians, those eternal automatons that still defended Zeffo temples millennia after their creators vanished. These proved to be dangerous opponents, forcing Cal to combine his lightsaber skills with clever use of the Force to overcome them. The Tomb of Eilram presented its challenges methodically. Cal had to understand how wind moved through the structure, how the great spheres could be positioned to channel that wind productively, how Force abilities could interact with mechanical systems to create the effects needed to progress deeper. It was a lesson in patience and observation, qualities that the ancient Zeffo had clearly valued. The tomb wasn't designed to be conquered through raw power. It required understanding, the willingness to study a situation before acting, the ability to see how different forces interacted with each other. As Cal progressed through Eilram's tomb, he began having visions. These weren't his memories, but Force echoes, impressions left behind by the Zeffo who had built and used this place. He saw them in their prime, felt their connection to the life wind, understood something of their philosophy. He also encountered recordings Cordova had left, holographic messages explaining what the Jedi Master had learned, providing context that helped Cal understand the civilization whose ruins he was exploring. Cordova's voice, calm and scholarly, guided Cal toward understanding that this wasn't just about obtaining an artifact. It was about learning from the past. The journey to retrieve the astrium from Miktrull's temple on Zeffo presented even greater challenges. This tomb was built high above a vast chasm, accessible only through treacherous passages where a single misstep meant a fatal fall. The puzzles were more complex, requiring Cal to manipulate multiple spheres in coordination to understand how different mechanisms interacted across large distances. Miktrull had designed this place to demand excellence, and millennia later, it still tested anyone who entered. Cal died and restarted attempts numerous times, learning from each failure, gradually understanding the logic underlying Miktrull's architectural puzzles. But it was on Dathomir that Cal encountered the darkest aspects of Zeffo history. Kujet's tomb radiated malevolence, the dark side energy so thick that Cal could feel it pressing against him, whispering doubts and fears, trying to undermine his confidence and purpose. The frozen figures of Kujet's victims lined the passages, their bodies preserved in their final, agonized moments, faces contorted in terror and pain. Cal could sense their lingering anguish, Force impressions of suffering so intense that they had imprinted permanently on this location. This was what the Zeffo had become at their worst. What happened when power mattered more than wisdom? Navigating Kujet's tomb required Cal to resist the dark side's pull. The puzzles were designed to encourage anger, frustration, the quickest path involving aggressive use of the Force rather than patient problem-solving. Cal had to consciously choose the light side approach, even when it was harder, even when the dark side whispered that taking the easier path was justified by the urgency of his mission. It was a test of character, and one that revealed what Cordova had understood. The Bogano Vault's contents should only go to someone who could resist corruption even under pressure. Throughout his journeys across Zeffo worlds,
Cal was learning. He was learning about an ancient civilization and its achievements and failures. He was learning Force techniques he hadn't known, abilities that the Zeffo had mastered and encoded into their architecture. He was reconnecting with his own Force powers, overcoming the fear and suppression that had characterized his years in hiding. And he was learning about himself, discovering that he had the strength to face Empire, to honor his Jedi heritage, to potentially make a difference in a galaxy that seemed determined to crush hope. The return to Bogano with the Astrium in hand felt like completion of a journey that had transformed Cal from a frightened survivor into something resembling a Jedi Knight. He'd proven himself in the temples of 3 different sages, each representing different aspects of what Force users could achieve and what they could become. He'd resisted the dark side on Dathomir. He'd demonstrated patience and wisdom in solving puzzles that had stumped countless treasure hunters over the millennia. He'd become worthy, by Zeffo standards and by the standards Cordova had applied when creating this entire elaborate test. The vault opened to the Astrium, revealing its deepest chambers. Here, in a room that the Zeffo had built and Cordova had repurposed, Cal found the holocron containing the list of Force-sensitive children. It was everything Seer had hoped for, everything they'd risked so much to obtain. With this information, they could find the next generation before the Empire did. They could potentially protect these children, train them, eventually rebuild what Order 66 had destroyed. The Zeffo's gift to the future, preserved by Cordova and claimed by Cal, might be the seed from which the Jedi Order grew again. But the moment of triumph was complicated. Cal had learned from the Zeffo's history. He'd seen what happened when a civilization became too focused on finding and training Force-sensitive individuals, when power became the primary criterion for leadership and respect. The Jedi had fallen, just like the Zeffo, victims of their own pride and the corruption of those they'd trusted. Was rebuilding the Order truly the right path? Or would it just repeat the cycle, creating a new generation of Jedi who would eventually fall to similar failures? Cal made a choice that surprised Seer, that might have disappointed Cordova if the Jedi Master had lived to see it. He decided not to use the holocron. He wouldn't hunt down Force-sensitive children and bring them into a life of conflict and danger. He wouldn't try to rebuild the Jedi Order in its previous form. Instead, he destroyed the holocron, ensuring that neither the Empire nor anyone else could use the list for their own purposes. He chose to let the Force-sensitive children live ordinary lives, free from the burden of Jedi expectations and Imperial persecution. It was an act of mercy, of wisdom and of faith that the Force would guide these children toward their proper paths without Jedi intervention. This decision represented Cal's full integration of the lessons he'd learned from Zeffo history. The Zeffo had believed they were wise enough to organize society around Force sensitivity, to elevate those with power and train them systematically.
But that approach had created the conditions for Kujet's corruption. The Jedi had believed themselves wise enough to serve as galactic peacekeepers, to identify Force-sensitive children and train them in Jedi ways. But that approach had led to Order 66. Perhaps, Cal reasoned, the better path was humility, trusting that individuals would find their own relationships with the Force, rather than imposing institutional structures that claimed to know what was best. The destruction of the holocron ended one story, but began another. Cal couldn't use Zeffo knowledge and Cordova's preparations to rebuild the old order, but he could use everything he'd learned to chart a different path forward. He could be a Jedi without the Order, could help people without claiming institutional authority, could teach by example rather than systematic indoctrination. The Zeffo's legacy, filtered through Cordova's scholarly understanding and Cal's practical experience, became something new. Not reconstruction, but reimagining, taking what was valuable from the past while leaving behind what had led to failure. Legacy and lessons. The Zeffo civilization has been gone for millennia. Their people fled or dead, their territories abandoned, their grand projects incomplete. Yet their influence persists, woven into the fabric of Star Wars canon in ways that continue to reveal themselves. The story of the Zeffo isn't just ancient history or background lore. It's a parable with ongoing relevance, a warning that echoes across eras, and a source of wisdom for those willing to learn from distant failures. The most obvious parallel is between the Zeffo and the Jedi Order. Both were Force-sensitive civilizations that achieved great things through their understanding of the Force. Both organized themselves hierarchically based on Force ability and wisdom. Both developed sophisticated philosophical frameworks for understanding the Force and training new generations in its use. And both fell catastrophically, victims of internal corruption and the fundamental vulnerabilities built into their structures. The parallel is so clear that Eno Cordova couldn't avoid seeing it, and it drove him to take extreme measures to prepare for what he knew was coming. But the parallel isn't perfect, and the differences are as instructive as the similarities. The Zeffo based their entire civilization on Force sensitivity. It was their defining characteristic, the foundation of their culture and governance. The Jedi Order, by contrast, existed within a larger galactic civilization of mostly non-Force sensitive beings. They served that civilization rather than ruling it, at least in theory. This gave the Jedi both constraints and protections that the Zeffo lacked. They couldn't simply impose their will the way Kujet could, because they had to maintain relationships with the Republic and respect democratic processes. But this also meant that when those relationships soured, when the Republic turned against them, the Jedi had nowhere to retreat to. The Zeffo at least had the option of exodus. The Jedi were scattered and hunted, with no safe haven to flee toward. The Zeffo's emphasis on mastery and control also mirrors aspects of Jedi philosophy, but with crucial differences in application. Both traditions taught that Force users should master their abilities, should control their emotions, should discipline themselves to become better instruments of the Force's will. But the Jedi emphasized service and selflessness, while the Zeffo seems to have focused more on personal achievement and wisdom. Kujet's corruption took Zeffo principles to a dark extreme. Absolute mastery, absolute control. The Force as something to be dominated rather than served. The Jedi's failure came from different roots, from becoming too entwined with political power, too confident in their own judgment, too certain that their service to the Republic was synonymous with serving the Force. The question of whether these failures were inevitable haunts both stories. Could the Zeffo have prevented Kujet's rise if they'd structured their society differently? Could the Jedi have avoided Order 66 if they'd made different choices during the Clone Wars or earlier? The answer seems to be that while the specific catastrophes might have been prevented, the underlying vulnerabilities were structural. Any civilization built primarily around Force sensitivity will concentrate power in the hands of those with Force abilities. That concentration creates opportunities for abuse. Any institution that claims special insight into moral truth will develop blind spots and rigid thinking. These aren't bugs that can be fixed with better rules or wiser leaders. They're features of the underlying approach, problems baked into the foundation. The lesson, then, isn't that Force users should abandon all attempts at organization or systematic training. It's that they must remain vigilant against the specific types of corruption that Force sensitivity creates. Pride in one's abilities, certainty that one's perception of the Force is correct and others are mistaken, the temptation to use power to impose one's will, justified by the belief that one knows better than others what should be done. These temptations are always present for Force users. Civilizations and institutions built around Force sensitivity must constantly guard against them, must build in humility and accountability, must remember that today's wisdom can become tomorrow's dogma if it isn't continually questioned and updated. The Zeffo's technological achievements also carry lessons. Their ability to blend Force use with mechanical systems created impressive results, but it also meant that their technology couldn't easily be transferred to other species or cultures. When the Zeffo disappeared, most of their innovations died with them because they required Force sensitivity to operate. The Jedi made similar choices, creating holocrons and other artifacts that only Force users could fully access. This protects sensitive knowledge from falling into wrong hands, but it also means that knowledge is vulnerable to being lost if Force users die out or lose their traditions. The broader Star Wars galaxy has absorbed the Zeffo's legacy in subtle ways. Their architectural influence can be seen in later Force-using cultures. Some of their understanding of how to construct Force-resonant spaces likely filtered into Jedi temple design, though whether through direct knowledge transfer or independent rediscovery remains unclear. The very fact that their ruins survived so intact that their tomb guardians still function provides practical demonstrations of technological principles that other civilizations can study and potentially adapt.
the connection between the Zeffo and other ancient civilizations, particularly the Celestials who built Corellia's planetary system, and the architects of the hyperspace routes, invites speculation about a broader pattern of advanced, force-sensitive civilizations rising and falling throughout galactic history. Were the Zeffo unique, or were they just one example of a recurring phenomenon? How many other civilizations achieved similar heights and then collapsed, leaving behind ruins that time eventually buried completely? The galaxy's history extends back tens of thousands of years before the Republic era. The Zeffo existed for perhaps a few thousand years before their fall. How many other Zeffo equivalents might have existed in earlier epochs, achieving greatness and then fading until not even ruins remained? The Ahsoka series' recent revelation of connections between Dathomir and Peridia, a planet in another galaxy entirely, suggests the Zeffo's influence extended further than anyone suspected. If Kujet explored, or even helped establish these cross-galactic pathways, it implies the Sages' power and ambition exceeded what the ruins in the known galaxy demonstrate. This opens possibilities for future stories. Did any Zeffo refugees make it to Peridia? Do their descendants exist in another galaxy, perhaps having learned from their ancestors' failures? Or did Kujet's dark side experiments doom any Zeffo who ventured that far, ensuring that their corruption spread even beyond their home galaxy? For Force users in the present era of Star Wars, the Zeffo represent both inspiration and warning. Inspiration in that they show what can be achieved through dedicated study of the Force, through blending mystical understanding with practical application, through building civilizations that recognize and celebrate Force sensitivity. Warning in that they demonstrate the dangers inherent in that very approach, the ways that power and pride can corrupt even the wisest traditions. Modern Force users, whether Jedi trying to rebuild their order or independent Force sensitives charting their own paths, must learn from both aspects of Zeffo history. Cal Kestis' ultimate decision to destroy the holocron rather than use it to rebuild the Jedi Order represents one possible lesson drawn from Zeffo history. His choice suggests that maybe the institutional approach is itself the problem, that Force users serve the galaxy better as individuals following their own paths, rather than as members of organizations that inevitably develop blind spots and vulnerabilities. This is a radical interpretation, one that many Jedi would reject, but it's grounded in reasonable reading of history. The Zeffo tried organization and systematic training. It led to Kujet. The Jedi tried organization and systematic training. It led to Order 66. Perhaps the pattern is clear enough that it's time to try something different. Alternatively, one could argue that the lesson is about humility and flexibility rather than abandoning organization entirely. The Zeffo failed because they became rigid, believing their way was the only way, concentrating power without adequate checks. The Jedi failed for similar reasons, becoming intertwined with political power, developing a hierarchy that struggled to question its own assumptions. But organization itself isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is organization without humility, structure without flexibility, tradition without willingness to adapt when circumstances change. The Zeffo also teach lessons about the preservation of knowledge.
Their multi-layered approach to encoding information, combining written records with functioning technology with force impressions, ensured that even after their civilization's complete collapse, much of what they'd learned survived for future generations to discover. This redundancy, this paranoia about knowledge being lost, proved justified. If they'd relied on a single method of preservation, their wisdom might have been lost forever. By using multiple approaches, they ensured that even partial recovery was possible. For archaeologists and scholars in the Star Wars universe, the Zeffo ruins remain treasure troves of information waiting to be fully decoded. Eno Cordova spent years studying them and admitted he'd barely scratched the surface of what they contained. Future researchers might discover new insights about the Force, new techniques that earlier Zeffo developed, new warnings about dangers that Cordova's generation didn't fully understand. The ruins are gifts that keep giving, teaching new lessons to each generation that studies them. The aesthetic influence of Zeffo architecture also deserves mention. Their distinctive style, with its sweeping curves, integrated energy spheres, wind mechanics, and force-responsive mechanisms, represents a unique approach to building that other cultures haven't replicated. Future architects interested in creating structures that enhance, rather than merely accommodate force use, have the Zeffo as exemplars. Their work demonstrates that buildings can be tools for developing consciousness, not just shelters for bodies. Perhaps the most important lesson the Zeffo offer is about memory and forgetting. They were forgotten so thoroughly that by the Republic era, essentially no one remembered they'd existed. A civilization that had achieved interstellar presence, that had built structures on multiple worlds, that had developed sophisticated understanding of the Force, vanished from collective memory. This is sobering. It suggests that civilizational memory is fragile, that even great achievements can be lost if not actively maintained. It reminds us that the galaxy's current dominant cultures, confident in their permanence, might also fade into obscurity given enough time and sufficient catastrophe. The Zeffo exist now as echoes in ancient ruins that still resist time's erosion, echoes in force impressions that linger at sites they held sacred, echoes in the warnings they left carved in stone for anyone wise enough to read and heed
them, and echoes in the stories we tell about them, narratives that keep their memory alive even as their physical presence fades further into the past. These echoes carry wisdom purchased at terrible price. The Zeffo paid for their insights with the destruction of their civilization. The least we can do is listen to what they're trying to tell us across the gulf of millennia. Conclusion. Echoes across time. As we reach the end of this exploration of the Zeffo civilization, it's worth stepping back to appreciate the bigger picture of what they represent within Star Wars mythology. The Zeffo aren't just background lore or convenient plot devices for a video game story. They're a meditation on power, wisdom, corruption, and loss. They're a reminder that the galaxy's history extends far beyond the familiar conflicts between Jedi and Sith, Republic and Empire. And they're a warning that remains relevant, regardless of which era of Star Wars you're examining. The galaxy far, far away has existed for an incomprehensible span of time. The stories we're most familiar with, the Skywalker saga, the Clone Wars, the Empire's rise and fall, these cover a period of maybe 70 years. That's less than a single human lifetime. But the galaxy's history extends back at least 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, possibly much further. The Zeffo existed and fell somewhere in that vast expanse of prehistory, leaving behind ruins that would stand empty for millennia before anyone rediscovered them. They remind us that our familiar characters and conflicts are just the most recent chapter in an unimaginably long story. This deep time perspective is important because it contextualizes both the achievements and failures of more recent civilizations. The Jedi Order existed for approximately 25,000 years before Order 66 destroyed it. That's an impressive run, a longevity that few institutions can claim. But the Zeffo achieved similar sophistication and presumably persisted for a significant time before their own fall. The lesson isn't that the Jedi were uniquely flawed or particularly doomed. It's that perhaps all civilizations, especially those built around Force sensitivity, carry within them the seeds of their eventual decline. The question isn't whether they'll fall, but when, and what they'll leave behind for those who come after. The Zeffo left behind remarkable things. Their temples still function after thousands of years of abandonment. Their tomb guardians still patrol corridors no Zeffo will ever walk again. Their inscriptions still warn anyone who can read them about the dangers of pride and unchecked power. These aren't minor contributions. They're gifts across time, messages in bottles cast into the future by a civilization that knew it was dying and wanted its death to mean something. The Zeffo couldn't save themselves, but they could try to save others from making the same mistakes. Eno Cordova understood this. His scholarly dedication to recovering Zeffo history wasn't just academic curiosity. It was recognition that the past speaks to the present if we're willing to listen. The warnings the Zeffo left were meant for civilizations like the Jedi Order, Force-sensitive cultures that might be walking similar paths towards similar disasters. Cordova listened to those warnings, understood them, and tried to prepare for what he saw coming. He couldn't prevent Order 66, just as the wisest Zeffo couldn't prevent Kujet's corruption. But he could ensure that the Order's destruction wasn't total, that some knowledge survived, that future generations had the chance to learn from multiple failures rather than repeating them blindly. Cal Kestis represents the next stage of this transmission of wisdom. He inherited Cordova's preparations without initially understanding their full context. He walked the same paths through Zeffo ruins that Cordova had walked years before. He saw the same warnings, felt the same Force impressions, struggled with the same puzzles. But Cal brought his own experiences and perspectives to what he learned. He was a survivor of Order 66, someone who'd watched the Jedi Order fall in real time. He had personal, visceral understanding of what institutional failure looked like. This colored how he interpreted Zeffo history and ultimately influenced his decision about what to do with the knowledge Cordova had preserved. The fact that Cal chose not to rebuild the Jedi Order in its previous form doesn't mean the Zeffo's lessons were wasted on him. If anything, it suggests he learned those lessons more thoroughly than someone who simply tried to reconstruct what had been lost. He understood that systems built around force sensitivity are vulnerable to specific types of corruption. He recognized that gathering and training force-sensitive children concentrates power in ways that create as many problems as they solve. He made the difficult choice to trust that the Force itself would guide these children to their proper paths, rather than imposing institutional structures that claimed to know better than the Force what should happen. This represents a genuinely different approach to being a Force user in the galaxy. Not a Jedi bound by the Code and the Order's traditions. Not a Sith pursuing power through passion and domination. Not even a gray Jedi trying to walk between the two extremes. Cal was trying to be something else entirely. Someone who used the Force and followed its guidance while remaining humble about his ability to understand what the Force wanted. Someone who helped people without claiming special authority. Someone who learned from both Jedi and Zeffo failures to chart a path that might avoid repeating them. Whether this approach will prove more successful than what came before remains to be seen. Cal's story continues in Jedi Survivor and presumably beyond. He'll face new challenges, make new choices, and potentially discover new limitations in his philosophy. But the fact that he's trying something different, that he's willing to learn from the past rather than simply reconstructing it, suggests wisdom that both the Zeffo and the Jedi ultimately lacked. They knew their ways were right and doubled down when challenged. Cal is willing to question, to adapt, to acknowledge that maybe the old ways weren't working regardless of how noble they seemed. The Zeffo's influence on Star Wars extends beyond the specific characters and storylines of Fallen Order. They've established precedent for ancient, force-sensitive civilizations that achieved greatness and then fell, leaving behind ruins that reward exploration. This opens narrative possibilities for future stories. How many other lost civilizations might exist? Their temples buried on unexplored worlds, their knowledge waiting to be recovered. What other warnings might they have left? What other approaches to understanding the Force might they have developed? The visual language the Zeffo brought to Star Wars is also distinctive and memorable. Their architecture, with its bronze spheres and wind-driven mechanisms, feels different from anything else in the galaxy. It's not the clean, curved aesthetic of Naboo. It's not the industrial brutalism of Imperial design. It's not the ancient stonework of Sith temples or the crystalline geometry of Jedi structures. It's something unique, immediately recognizable as Zeffo even if you couldn't name the civilization. This visual distinctiveness helps the galaxy feel larger and more varied, reminding us that countless cultures have risen and fallen over the millennia, each with its own aesthetic and philosophical approach. The naming conventions the Zeffo used are also worth noting. Eilram, Miktrull, Kujet. These names have weight and strangeness. They don't sound like names from other Star Wars cultures. They're alien without being unpronounceable, distinctive without being ridiculous. The same applies to the term life wind for the Force.
It's poetic and evocative, while being grounded in the physical reality of their windswept homeworld. These linguistic choices add depth to the Zeffo, making them feel like a real culture with its own language and conceptual frameworks, rather than just generic ancient aliens. The game mechanics built around Zeffo ruins also deserve appreciation. Respawn Entertainment created puzzles that feel like they belong to the world rather than being arbitrary video game challenges. The wind mechanics, the sphere manipulation, the need to understand how force abilities interact with mechanical systems, all of this emerges naturally from what we know about Zeffo philosophy and capabilities. The gameplay teaches players about the Zeffo while challenging them, making the act of exploration itself educational. You learn how the Zeffo thought by working through the problems they designed, by seeing the world from their perspective, by using the Force in ways that their philosophy
emphasized. This integration of gameplay and narrative is part of why the Zeffo have resonated with players and why they feel like a meaningful addition to Star Wars, rather than just background lore. You're not just told about an ancient civilization. You experience their legacy directly. You walk their halls, solve their puzzles, fight their guardian automatons, and gradually piece together their story from environmental clues and scattered inscriptions. By the time you understand what happened to them, you've invested hours in exploring their ruins, making their tragedy feel earned rather than simply exposition dumped. The Zeffo also raise interesting questions about canon and continuity within Star Wars. They're a relatively recent addition, introduced in 2019. Yet they're positioned as having existed thousands of years before any other Star Wars story. This creates both opportunities and challenges. The opportunity is that you can reference the Zeffo in stories set at any point in the timeline. Their ruins exist throughout the Star Wars eras, available to be discovered by characters in the Old Republic, the Clone Wars, the Imperial era, or the sequel trilogy timeframe. The challenge is ensuring that references remain consistent, that we don't learn things about the Zeffo that contradict what Fallen Order established. So far, Star Wars has handled this well. The references to the Zeffo in other media have been sparse but consistent. The Ahsoka series' connection between Dathomir and Peridia potentially links to Kujet's presence on Dathomir without contradicting anything we know from Fallen Order. Future stories might explore Zeffo ruins on worlds we haven't seen yet, or reveal new details about their civilization's extent and capabilities. But as long as these additions remain consistent with the established framework, they enrich rather than undermine the original introduction. The thematic resonance between the Zeffo and various other Star Wars storylines is striking when you look for it. The fall of Zeffo civilization parallels not just the fall of the Jedi, but also the corruption of Anakin Skywalker. In both cases, you have someone with enormous power who believes that power gives them the right to impose their will. In both cases, the corruption starts with seemingly reasonable grievances or goals, but spirals into atrocity. In both cases, the individual becomes convinced that they're doing what's necessary, that the ends justify the means, that their superior understanding of the Force means others should submit to their judgment. The Zeffo's emphasis on mastery and control also echoes themes explored in The Last Jedi, where Luke Skywalker has become disillusioned with the Jedi Order and believes it's time for it to end. Luke's reasoning that the Jedi's legacy is failure and their attempts to control the Force led to disaster could be applied equally to the Zeffo.
Both civilizations believed they had figured out the right way to relate
to the Force, developed systematic approaches to training and philosophy, and then discovered too late that their certainty had blinded them to fundamental problems. Luke's ultimate conclusion, that the Force belongs to everyone, and not just to those who claim special understanding of it, resonates with the lessons that could be drawn from Zeffo history. The Mandalorian's exploration of what it means to be connected to the Force without being a Jedi also has interesting parallels to Zeffo philosophy. Grogu is clearly Force-sensitive and powerful, but his path doesn't have to follow traditional Jedi training. He can develop his abilities in his own way, guided by multiple teachers with different perspectives. This flexibility, this willingness to acknowledge that there are many valid ways to be Force-sensitive, feels like wisdom that the Zeffo might have benefited from. Their rigid hierarchy based on Force power, their certainty about the right way to understand the life wind, these created vulnerabilities that more flexible approaches might have avoided. Looking forward, the Zeffo have established themselves as part of Star Wars mythology in ways that ensure they'll remain relevant. Future Jedi or Force users exploring their origins will likely encounter Zeffo ruins just as Cal did. Stories set in the deep past might explore the Zeffo at their height, showing their civilization before Kujet's corruption. Tales set in the unknown regions might reveal what happened to the Zeffo refugees, whether they survived and rebuilt, or perished in the dangers of unexplored space. The flexibility of having an ancient, disappeared civilization means you can reference them without being locked into specific details about their current status. The Zeffo also provide useful shorthand for discussing certain themes and concepts. When discussing the dangers of Force user pride and institutional corruption, you can point to the Zeffo as an example. When talking about how civilizations preserve knowledge across catastrophic collapse, the Zeffo's multi-layered approach offers lessons. When designing ancient temples or ruins in new Star Wars content, the Zeffo's architectural principles provide a template that feels consistent with established lore. They've become a tool that creators can use to add depth and resonance to stories, without needing to explain everything from scratch. For fans of Star Wars, the Zeffo represent something that the franchise sometimes struggles to deliver. Genuinely new additions that feel like they've always belonged. They're not contradicting or replacing anything that came before. They're filling in prehistory, adding depth to the galaxy's ancient past, and providing context that enriches our understanding of later events. When done well, this kind of addition makes Star Wars feel bigger and more lived in, like we're exploring a real galaxy with real history, rather than just watching whatever the plot demands. The Zeffo succeeded in this because Respawn Entertainment and Lucasfilm put thought into their creation. They weren't just ancient Force users as generic set dressing. They were a fully realized civilization with their own aesthetic, philosophy, language, and trajectory from achievement to catastrophe. They had individual members with distinct personalities and legacies. They had architectural principles that made sense given their environment and beliefs. They had technology that logically emerged from their understanding of the Force. Every aspect of their presentation suggested a real culture rather than a hastily invented plot device. This level of care in world building is what makes Star Wars special at its best. The galaxy feels vast and ancient because it's populated with details like the Zeffo, civilizations and stories that exist in the background, enriching the main narratives without overwhelming them. Not every story needs to reference the Zeffo, but the fact that they exist, that their ruins are out there waiting to be explored, makes the galaxy feel more complete. It suggests depth beyond what any single story can show, history beyond what any one character can experience. As we close this exploration of Zeffo civilization, several thoughts linger. First, the recognition that power without wisdom is dangerous, regardless of how it's acquired. The Zeffo's deep connection to the life wind didn't protect them from corruption, because connection to power isn't the same as wisdom about how to use it. Second, the understanding that even the wisest civilizations carry within them the potential for catastrophic failure. The Zeffo weren't stupid or evil in their origins. They were thoughtful, sophisticated, and genuinely seeking understanding. But they still fell because they couldn't recognize and address the vulnerabilities built into their systems. Third, the appreciation for how civilizations preserve knowledge. The Zeffo might be gone, but their warnings remain. Their temples still teach anyone willing to learn. Their inscriptions still offer wisdom to those who can read them. This suggests that legacy isn't about preventing your own fall, but about ensuring that others can learn from it. The Zeffo failed to save themselves, but they might still save others if those others pay attention to what the ruins are saying. Finally, humility. The Zeffo believed they had figured out the right way to understand and relate to the Force. That certainty made them vulnerable when someone like Kujet twisted their teachings toward dark purposes. The Jedi believed they were the guardians of peace and justice, wise enough to guide the Republic and train Force sensitives properly. That certainty blinded them to their own corruption and the trap closing around them. Every civilization that achieves significant Force mastery seems to develop this same fatal certainty. The lesson, repeated across Zeffo and Jedi history, is that certainty is the enemy of wisdom. The moment you believe you've figured it all out is the moment you stop questioning, stop adapting, and start the slide toward failure. The winds still blow across the Zeffo homeworld. They flow through ruined cities where no one lives. They whisper through temple passages where no students come to learn. They move the great bronze spheres in puzzles that no Zeffo will ever solve again. The life wind, as they called it, continues its eternal motion, indifferent to the civilization that once studied it so carefully. The Force flows on, regardless of who claims to understand it, regardless of which civilizations rise and fall in their attempts to master it. And somewhere out there, perhaps in the unknown regions, or perhaps in dimensions beyond normal space, the last Zeffo might still exist, changed beyond recognition, or perhaps finally having learned the lessons that eluded them in their days of glory. We can't know. The mystery remains unsolved, the story incomplete. But the echoes of what they were, the warnings they left, the wisdom purchased with their civilization's destruction, these persist, these matter, these might yet make a difference for someone wise enough to listen. The Zeffo are gone, but they're not forgotten. And as long as their temples stand, as long as their guardians patrol empty halls, as long as explorers like Cordova and Kestis find their way to Zeffo ruins and learn from what they discover there, the ancient civilization continues to serve its final purpose. Not to be remembered as great, though they were great, not to be mourned, though their loss diminished the galaxy, but to teach, to warn, to help others avoid the same mistakes, to be the cautionary tale that perhaps, just perhaps, makes the difference between survival and extinction for the next civilization that walks the same dangerous path. That's the legacy of the Zeffo. Not monuments to pride, but warnings written in stone. Not temples to greatness, but classrooms teaching lessons learned through failure. Not a civilization that conquered the Force, but one that learned too late that the Force cannot be conquered, only respected. And in that learning, in that final understanding purchased at ultimate cost, they left behind something valuable, something that might matter to Force users across all the eras of Star Wars history, something that whispers the same message in different languages across the millennia. Fear not the Force, but fear the pride that makes you think you've mastered it. Trust not in systems and hierarchies, but in the humble recognition that you might be wrong. Seek not to gather power, but to understand why power corrupts even the wise. Remember not your triumphs, but your failures, because failures teach while victories often blind. And above all, know that the life wind, the Force, the cosmic energy that binds the galaxy together doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. You're part of it. And the moment you forget that, the moment you try to make it serve you rather than serving it, you've taken the first step on the path that led the Zeffo to their doom. These are the echoes of an ancient, Force-sensitive civilization speaking across thousands of years to anyone who will listen. The Zeffo are gone, but their voice remains, carried on the wind that never stops blowing, encoded in temples that refuse to fall, preserved in the Force itself, for those with eyes to see and wisdom to understand. May we hear them. May we learn. May we do better than they did, than the Jedi did, than all the proud civilizations that believed their understanding made them invincible. The wind blows, the Force flows, the echoes persist, and the story continues, always reaching toward the same questions that the Zeffo asked and failed to answer completely. What does it mean to understand the Force? How should those with power relate to those without? Can any civilization built on Force sensitivity avoid eventually falling to corruption? Is there a way forward that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past? We don't have complete answers. Perhaps there are no complete answers. But we have the Zeffo's example, their warnings, their wisdom purchased through suffering. We have Eno Cordova's dedication to learning from ancient failures. We have Cal Kestis's willingness to question whether rebuilding what was lost is always the right choice. We have all the pieces scattered throughout Star Wars, fragments of understanding waiting to be assembled into something that might, just might, point toward a better way. The Zeffo began their journey seeking to understand the life wind, to master their connection to it, to elevate their civilization through Force understanding. They achieved remarkable things. They built wonders. They developed wisdom. And then they fell, brought down by the same forces they thought they'd mastered. Their ruins stand as monuments to that trajectory, to the pattern that plays out again and again across galactic history. Achievement, pride, corruption, fall. But the ruins also stand as schools, teaching anyone willing to learn. The puzzles they contain aren't just obstacles, they're lessons about patience, observation, and understanding how different forces interact. The warnings they preserve aren't just history, they're guidance for the future. The Zeffo failed, but they failed in ways that illuminate the path toward success if we're wise enough to read the signs they left behind. So here's the final thought as we conclude this deep exploration of the Zeffo civilization. They matter not because they were great, though they were, not because they achieved remarkable things, though they did. They matter because they failed in instructive ways, because they left behind evidence of their failure, and because those failures parallel the challenges that Force users continue to face across all eras of Star Wars. They're a mirror showing us truths we might prefer to ignore. They're teachers whose lessons hurt, but need to be heard. They're the voice of experience warning against paths that seem promising but lead to darkness. May their echoes never fade entirely. May each new generation of Force users discover Zeffo ruins and learn from them. May the warnings carved in ancient temples remain legible for millennia yet to come. May the wisdom purchased with Zeffo civilization's destruction continue to guide others away from similar fates. And may we all remember that pride comes before the fall, that power corrupts even the wise, and that the Force belongs to no one, no matter how sophisticated our understanding or how powerful our abilities. The life wind blows eternal. The Zeffo are gone. The lessons remain, and the galaxy turns, carrying within it the possibility that someone, someday, will finally learn from all these ancient failures and find a way forward that doesn't repeat them. That's the hope the Zeffo's ruins represent. Not that we can avoid failure entirely, but that we can learn from failure, ours and others, and maybe, just maybe, do a little better than those who came before. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the haunting history of the Zeffo civilization. If you found this exploration fascinating, if the story of this lost civilization resonated with you, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the Star Wars galaxy, so many forgotten corners of lore and hidden connections between stories. Your support helps me continue bringing you these deep examinations of the mythology that makes Star Wars so rich and compelling. Until next time, may the Force be with you, and may you learn from the echoes that ancient civilizations left behind. Sleep well and dream of wind-swept worlds where temples wait in silence, holding wisdom for those brave enough to seek it and humble enough to learn from it. Good night.